Okay, in this video, I'd like to talk about a book which I purchased recently. This book is called The Deep Roots of Modern Democracy by American scientist John Gerring, together with some of his colleagues. And the purpose of this book, as you can understand from the title, is to explain the deep roots, to explain the ultimate causes of why democracy today exists in the Western world, or to be more precise, of why this phenomenon of democracy firstly emerged in the Western world and it developed there and then it diffused to the rest of the world from Europe or from the West more generally. Now, before I go and analyze the argument of the book, first things first, for John Gerring, the ultimate cause and the ultimate reason for democratization in the West is one geographic factor, and that's the proximity to natural harbors. And before I explain the mechanisms, I'd like to draw your attention to two very important points. The first point is that although the title of the book says the deep roots of modern democracy, okay, but I think that we have to elaborate a little bit on the definitions. When we generally talk about modern democracy, what's understood is some ideals which are generally accepted in the West today. For instance, the ideal of universal adult suffrage, that everyone is eligible to go and elect their leaders, okay, in fair and competitive elections, for instance. The second idea is that the ultimate legitimacy of power stems from people, right? These kind of ideas are modern, okay, and they did not exist for a very long time. But we know that parliaments, assemblies, and councils, they existed for a very long time without these ideas. And the argument of, although the title has that, mentions the modern democracy, when you read the book, you understand that those councils and those assemblies, those parliaments, which existed for a very long time in Europe and outside of Europe, right? For John Gerring, natural harbors are conducive to development of those assemblies, of those councils and parliaments, which existed without the universal suffrage, which existed without the idea of, the ultimate legitimate power residing in people, right? So I think that we have to make this distinction. So the definitions are used correctly. And I think that here it would be more helpful to go with the definition of another American political scientist, David Stasavich, which also has a recent publication on the topic, and maybe I'll talk about that book in a separate video. He actually divides all political regimes in two parts, right? One type of political regime is where you have a central authority, when you have a ruler, and that ruler rules with the help of his bureaucracy which was appointed by that ruler himself or herself. And the second type of a regime is where you have a ruler, or maybe in some cases you even don't have a ruler, but at the same time this ruler, he rules together with a council, or together with an assembly, or together with a parliament, okay? And that parliament is not appointed by him, okay? This parliament is either elected, or maybe it's sometimes it's just the nobility which sits in that parliament, and they do not change. But the idea is that the ruler rules together with some other people who constrain his power to a certain degree, okay? In some societies, this constraint may be very broad. In some other societies, it may be not so broad, okay? But the main idea is, the main difference between these two types of political regime is that in one of them, you have a society which is ruled by ruler only. This is more authoritarian regime. And the second type is where it's a less authoritarian regime, where ruler is constrained to a certain degree, okay? So he has to negotiate with some other people. He has to negotiate with councils. So I think that this, going with these definitions, which I would call, the first one I'll call more authoritarian regime, and the second one more parliamentary regime. I do understand that there are some problems with this definition, but I think it's more helpful. Okay, so in first case you have a parliamentarism, okay, where you have councils, where you have where you have councils, you have assemblies, where you have parliaments, and the second one, when you don't have those things, you have just a ruler and his bureaucracy. Okay, and if you read John Gerring's book, we understand that what he means, that natural harbors are conducive to the first type of regime where you have parliament. It's not only about the modern democracy. For him, it's like a process. It's a very long process. For instance, in Europe, you had after the Roman Empire, or even during the Roman Empire, those political entities which existed in Europe, they had ad hoc parliaments, they had ad hoc assemblies. Later on, they developed into more formal parliaments, okay, with maybe written constitutions or written rules. And then they developed in late 19th century and at the beginning of 20th century, they developed in what we know as modern democracies, okay? I think that it was very important to make this point clear. And the second point is that John Gerring is among those political scientists who believe that idea of representation, idea of popular rule existed not only in the West. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the received history of democracy, okay, still lots of scholars, they will say that democracy emerged, say, first in Greece or in Athens, then it traveled to Roman Republic, okay, and after the downfall of Republic, after the Rome became an empire, as Robert Dahl, one of the most prominent political scientists of the 20th century, put it, that democracy or the popular rule actually disappeared from the face of the earth for another 1,000 years, and then, according to this received history, it re-emerged 1,000 years later in Italian city-states, and then it traveled again throughout the Europe to the United Provinces, and then England with its glorious revolution of 1688, American Civil War, American Revolution, French Revolution, and then the first wave of democratization, again the term which was used by Robert Dahl again in the late 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. So in this history, democracy and democracy and generally parliamentarism, okay, the idea of councils, idea of popular rule is something which is peculiar to the West. But now we know it more and more, and I believe that it will become some sort of consensus in a very short time, that actually councils and parliaments and generally popular rule existed throughout the world, in many other societies, not only in the Western societies. And John Gerring is actually is in the list of those scholars who support this idea. For instance, if you look at the same author which I mentioned before, David Stasavage, he brings up lots of examples of councils. For instance, the American tribes prior to the advent of Europeans, like Hurons and Iroquois, these tribes, they actually had councils. The Hurons, they had councils on 3 different levels. They had councils on the level of their villages, and then they had their councils on the level of their on several villages which comprised one particular tribe. This is the second level, and then they had council on the level of general Huron population, okay, or we can call it Confederate level. Anyway, so these 2 points are very important when we talk about, exactly in this book. When we talk about natural harbors are conducive to general idea of parliamentarism, okay, of what I will call parliamentarism. Lots of scholars, for instance, David Stasavage calls it an early democracy, okay. That's for him, for instance, let me give you this example as well. The period prior to the advent of, or prior to the establishment of Umayyad Empire, in Islamic world, what traditionally Muslims call the period of righteous caliphs, right? This period of those 4 caliphs, David Stasavage actually calls this period an example of early democracy, because there was some sort of election, okay? So all those 4 caliphs, they became rulers after some sort of election. It was not, the type of election we can find right now, where everyone participates in an election. Okay, so there wasn't any universal suffrage, but there was some election. Okay, for instance, the most authoritative people within the society, they participated in election, or maybe the leaders of tribes, knowledgeable persons. Okay, but at the end of the day, there was an election. It wasn't a ruler just ruling with his bureaucracy. That's why for David Savage, it is an example of an early democracy. So that's why I think it was important to make these 2 points quite clear. And after we know this, the question would be, if there were councils and lots of places around the world, or assemblies, why these assemblies, they became parliaments only in Europe. Okay, ultimately in other parts of the world, as I told you, for instance, example of the Middle East, there were councils. Okay, there was that what I call parliamentary ruling for a while, but at the end of the day, they switched to more authoritarian rule with a stronger central power, right? A stronger centralized government. Let me put it like this. So what was the ultimate cause of that? For John, and it did not happen in Europe. For John Gerring, the answer resides in one geographical factor, which is called the proximity to natural harbors. And natural harbors for him are those places which are quite conducive to the building because of their physical characteristics, geographical characteristics. They are conducive to building ports. Okay, so you have lots of natural harbors. It means you have an ability to build a port there. And let me just explain the mechanisms. Okay, for John Gerring, the proximity to closer you get to natural harbors, it becomes easier. I mean, it enhances the mobility of people. It enhances the mobility of goods. It enhances the mobility of ideas and capital. Okay, and all of this ultimately shifts the balance of power from the ruling elite, from the ruler, to citizens. Okay, and as we know throughout the history, more rulers needed their citizens more rights and privileges they were ready to grant in response, right? And in several cases, these privileges, they include the privilege or the right of political participation. Now, but let me get deeper in mechanisms of how natural harbors, they may enhance this idea of parliamentarism, idea of, the emergence of councils and assemblies and so on. Now, it happens primarily, according to John Gerring, through 5 mechanisms, and let me go one by one through all of these mechanisms. The first one is economic development. Okay, we know from the history and the link between the commerce and the access to sea or ocean. It was actually noticed by Adam Smith and lots of other scholars hundreds of years ago. We know that whenever there's an access to the sea or to the ocean, it's easier to conduct trade, because prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the advent of railroads, prior to the advent of planes and so on, the trade which was conducted by sea or by waterways generally, was at least 10, 20, or some scholars may go even higher, 10, 20, or 30 times cheaper than the trade which was conducted by land. Which means that if you have lots of natural harbors, you've got an ability to build ports, and then you can conduct lots of trade. And trade brought prosperity. That's exactly the reason why those cities, port cities, historically they were much more prosperous than places which did not have an access to waterways. Okay, so the first mechanism is that natural harbors lead to ports, and ports lead to trade. Okay, and that trade brings economic development. This is the first part of the mechanism. And the second part is that, if it's a port city, it will attract two types of people. Firstly, the manufacturers, because they want to go closer to the trade hubs, okay? So it's easier for them to sell whatever they manufacture. And secondly, definitely it will also attract merchants themselves. And manufacturers and merchants, traditionally, they tended to be more educated, more literate than the general population, because they just need to be able to read and write in order to conduct their businesses. Okay, so this mechanism also increases the human capital in those cities, in those places which are close to natural harbors. Now, we have natural harbors. Natural harbors, they are conducive to economic development, and also they rise the level of education. And both of these factors, they affect democratization, or let me say parliamentarism. They affect or they make it more likely for parliaments, for assemblies to emerge. Why? Why is that? The first argument, or the first mechanism which John Gerring mentions, is that richer the merchant class gets, okay, richer they get, more political participation, more political power they demand, for instance, in return for those taxes they pay, okay, and more political power they demand. At the same time, they demand this political power or these political rights to be enshrined in some sort of constitution, or to be written down. Why is that? If you look at those, vast land empires, those land empires, they were dominated by military elites, which means that the ruler, he had to negotiate with those military elites. Okay, so for instance, the ruler promises something to the military elite. And what happens is that whenever the ruler tries to renege on his promises, okay, he tries not to fulfill his promises, this military elite, because the nature of their or let me put it like this: because they have an access, or because they have a monopoly of violence, okay, they don't need any written constitutions, they don't need any written rules to force that ruler to follow actually his promises. They have arms, they have power, okay, so it helps them to force him in any way. But merchants as a class, they don't have an access to violence. They don't have armies, okay? So they cannot. They know that if the ruler tries not to follow his promises, we're not able to force him. That's why during the negotiations, they explicitly demand those political rights to be written in forms of constitution, or to be written down in some particular way, okay, to be formalized. And one of the ways to formalize those political rights is the establishment of parliaments, establishment of councils and assemblies where they participate, okay? That's the first way of how the economic development leads to the establishment of parliaments. And the second way is simply that, as I mentioned previously, as the city becomes more educated, okay, people become more educated, they actually demand more of political rights, okay. This is, simply human psychology. By the way, all of this is just the argument of John Gerring, okay. I don't mean that everything what he explains, some arguments are stronger than other arguments. Well, my purpose here is just to present his argument. Anyway, this was the first mechanism. The second mechanism of how natural harbors enhances parliamentarism is through the military organization, okay? Because military organization of those political units which have lots of natural harbors, have lots of ports, they tend to be focused more on navy rather than on standing land army, because firstly, they have to protect their trade, and secondly, because there's a threat which comes from the direction of sea, right? So to protect the city from the attack, and at the same time to protect the trade, they have to invest more in their navy rather than in land standing army. And there is two fundamental differences between navy and standing army. Navy tends to have less people in it, and secondly, it tends to have more technologically advanced. And according to John Gerring, it has an effect on parliamentarism in the following way. Imagine that there is a ruler who tries to be a tyrant, okay? So this would-be tyrant, if he is a ruler of a land empire, or let me say, the political entity which doesn't have lots of natural harbors. In that case, he has more people, okay, to suppress the possible rebellion. So he tries to become a tyrant. At the same time, he knows that people will try to rebel, but he has lots of people. If he doesn't have a navy, he invests in standing army, and he has more people to suppress that rebellion. But the would-be tyrant in a political entity which has lots of natural harbors, which means it invests more in its navy, has less people to suppress that rebellion. That's the first way. And the second way, which is a little bit more apparent, is that it's actually because the unrest, the rebellion, the revolt is more probable. It's more probable that this unrest will happen in the city and not on the sea. Well, I think it's clear that it's easier to use the standing army to suppress the rebellion in the city or or on land. Okay, it's easier than try to apply the knowledge or try to use navy to suppress a rebellion which happens actually in the city. So I hope that my point is clear. So it's harder for according to John Gerring, it's harder to use navy in suppression of the rebellion which happens on land, rather than using the standing land army in the suppression of rebellion which happens on land again. So this is his point. This is the idea, the mechanism of how the military organization, the difference in military organization between those political entities which have lots of natural harbors and those who don't have those natural harbors, may actually lead to the more authoritarian rule, okay, in second case, and less authoritarian rule in the first case. The third mechanism of how natural harbors may affect the democratization, or let me say parliamentarism, I actually like this term more, is through the state building. Okay, so according to John Gerring, those places, as Europe, which has lots of natural harbors, Europe actually has much more natural harbors than any other part of the world. Those parts of the world, Europe itself, becomes more fragmented, more political fragmented, which means that there are lots of small political entities, okay, lots of small countries or city-states, okay. Why does this happen? Firstly, because, as we told previously, those cities which exist there, they become wealthier. And wealthier the city becomes, it's easier for that city to defend itself from a would-be tyrant, from some tyrant, or from someone who tries to be an emperor and tries to unite, let's say, Europe as an empire. That's exactly why after the downfall of Roman Empire, there is no return of empire in the Western Europe, okay? And if you look at the history, you will see that those small city-states of northern Italy, they were able to defend themselves against bigger enemies, okay? And mightier enemies like France and Spain, exactly because they were very wealthy, and they were able to hire mercenaries to fight for them. Okay, and the second reason, by the way, the same applies also to the United Provinces, because they were very rich, they were able to fight against the biggest threat against them, Philip II and Habsburg, and Habsburgs trying to subjugate United Provinces. The famous Dutch revolt, which actually lasted for 80 years, and at the end of the day, they were victorious. I mean, the United Provinces, the Dutch Empire, it was victorious. Okay, although they were much smaller than Habsburgs, and at the same time, lots of bullion, gold and silver, was received by Philip II from America. But still, they were able to defend themselves because they are wealthier. At the same time, the coordination between those cities, okay, is easier. Okay, because it's easier to coordinate your actions when you have an access to the sea, because the communication is faster. Okay, due to these two reasons, John Gerring believes that more natural harbors you have, more fragmented Europe became. Okay, so it was fragmented, lots of lots of small political entities. Okay, and when we are talking about the size, when I'm saying small, it is relative to the rest of the world. Okay, relative to those empires which existed in the Middle East, which existed in India, or which existed in China. Okay. So, but how this fragmentation leads to parliamentarism, in two very important roles, and actually these mechanisms were emphasized by lots of scholars before John Gerring as well. The first one is that smaller the political entity is, easier it is to establish a parliament. Why? Because prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was very hard. If you have a very big political entity like an empire, it's very hard to have a council or assembly, because you have to have at least representatives coming from the all parts of the empire. Okay, and it took very, very long time. Imagine that. And by the way, it's the example which was given by David the Savage, and for him it is one of the reasons why parliamentarism did not survive after the expansion of Muslim lands. Okay, imagine that only in few decades, Muslim armies, they were able to conquer vast territories stretching from the Spain in the west to the China in the east. Okay, imagine that you want to have a council. Okay, then how much time would it take for representatives to reach there, for instance, in the capital city of Baghdad or some other capital city, to reach there from Spain or from China, okay, to negotiate things, and if they have to refer back to those people who sent them, they have to go back, and then they have to come again to Baghdad and negotiate further. Okay, that would have been impossible at that time. So the point is, the smaller political entity gets, it's easier actually to have parliament councils. That's why in some of Italian city-states, because it's just a city, it was able to let everyone know that the parliament is assembling just by ringing a bell, right? I guess it was in Siena. So that's the first mechanism of how political fragmentation has an effect on parliamentarism. The second one is, for John Gerring, is that smaller the political entities get, they tend to fight each other more intensively. And more intensively, those small political entities in Europe, they fight each other more. They need their population. For instance, they need more of aristocracy in order to supply warriors. They need more of church support for ideological support of the war they are conducting. They need more of money, okay? So they give more privileges to merchant class. Again, if they mobilize ordinary people to fight for them, again, they have to give something in return, and this is, well, the political rights, okay? So the general idea is that they fight more, okay? They fight more frequently, which means that they need their population more, okay? different classes. In some cases, they need ordinary people as well, and more they need those classes, in some cases ordinary people, more political rights they give in return. So the parliamentarism is established. Okay, this was, I believe, the third mechanism. The fourth mechanism which he mentions is that port cities, simply because lots of migrants are coming here, out there, or simply because merchants are coming from all over the world, the idea is that after some time, people which live in those port cities in natural or close to the natural harbors, they tend to be more tolerant of cultural differences between themselves and other people. Okay, and more tolerant they get, according to John Gerring's argument, more tolerant they get, it is more conducive to parliamentarism. Now, this argument actually is, well, I know, in some cases it seems quite plausible, because I lived in a country where if you go to those parts of the country which are far away from the sea, in those parts of the country, yeah, people are not as open as people are in port cities. I've seen it myself. But on the other hand, if you look at the present situation in Europe, you see that because of that, I know, because of maybe economic situation is not as good as it was, or for some other reasons, many Europeans today, well, they don't like migrants. Okay, so they are against of immigrants coming to their country. Okay, so today it seems that the mechanism actually works in a different direction. So that's why I'm not quite sure about this argument. But anyway, I'm just presenting his argument. And the last mechanism is about an exit option. For John Gerring, more access, more natural harbors are out there, merchants have more access to what we call an exit option. So let me just illustrate it in an example. Imagine that you have lots of port cities along the sea or ocean. Okay. And the rulers of the cities, they will not have an incentive to levy very high taxes on merchants. Okay, why? Because if in a particular city you have very high taxes, okay, then the merchant has a very easy exit option, not to come to your city, but to go and conduct his business in a neighboring city. Okay, so it's very easy for him to exit. Okay, that's why the incentive, the motivation for the rulers will be to keep those taxes as low as possible. At the same time, they will have a motivation to grant some rights, some privileges, for instance, to respect the property rights, to respect the rule of law. Again, because of the same mechanism, they have an exit options. If the merchants, I guess, they have an exit option. If the ruler is not following his promises, if ruler does not respect their property rights, okay, seizes their property, arbitrarily increases taxation, then it's very easy for merchant class just to switch to another city, right, and conduct their business there. Again, you can add another feature here, is that if you have if you have an access to the sea or ocean, it's easier to smuggle goods. Okay, again, it's harder to tax, as opposing to when you have one river. And this again, John Gerring's argument is that wherever you have a river, it's easier actually to have a surveillance over the trade which is conducted by that river. Okay, so it's easier to tax. That's why those places where the economic activity is situated along one big river, they tend to be more authoritarian, according to John Gerring. So this was the fifth and final mechanism of how natural harbors they enhance parliamentarism through the exit option. Okay, so the merchant class always had an exit option, just to switch to another city and conduct their business there. And by the way, if you look at history, it has some justification in history, because if you look, for instance, at those, if you look at Hansa, okay, which was some sort of a league trade the cities which had an agreement, okay, between each other. This Hansa was well, lots of cities which was part of that Hansa League, and if you look at the history, you will see that at a particular time, one city became economically and politically dominant in that league, okay? But after some time, another city became more prosperous, okay? Why is that? Because, well, something happens to that city. Let's say the ruler is not following his promises. Then the activity, the trade, the merchant activity may easily go to another city because it's close, because it's ocean, so it's easier to conduct trade. It's easier to move from one side to another side, and that's exactly what happened in Hansa. For instance, for a long time, Lübeck was the economically dominant city in Hansa, and then it switched more to the western part, to United Provinces, and so on. So through these 5 mechanisms which I mentioned, John Gerring's argument is that parliamentarism was the reason why parliamentarism actually, this is his theoretical argument, the reason why parliamentarism well, it was established and it was preserved in Europe and not anywhere else, was because Europeans had much more access to natural harbors. And then he conducts some sort of a statistical analysis just to show that, show us some numbers, okay? And there are some very, very good maps in his book as well. But just think about this statistic, that the average distance to the natural harbor in Europe is only 170 kilometers, okay? But in contrast, if you think about the Middle East, Muslim lands, then the average distance to closest natural harbor is 500 kilometers, okay? And if you look farther east to China, so the average distance becomes 900 kilometers. So what he wants to say by presenting these numbers is that my theoretical argument is actually compatible with these statistics. Again, if you look inside these regions themselves, according to John Gerring, you'll find that the regions with most access to natural harbors in Europe are England, the Low Countries, you know, the parts where we have Belgium and Netherlands today, and also Scandinavia. And these parts historically were more democratic, according to his definition, or had more parliaments, according to my definition. Okay. Again, it explains you some regional differences in Middle East as well, because he cites actually a historian which talks about, in a very long citation, about the history of Oman prior to the advent of British troops to Oman. Well, actually, what happened in that region is that people were electing their rulers. Okay, in contrast to those big land empires of Muslim world. Okay. In this part, which was, well, which had more access to oceans through the natural harbors. Here there were councils which actually councils comprised from the elderly people, from the the tribal leaders, and comprised of merchants, and those people actually came together in councils and elected their leaders. Okay, and they also had an option to impeach their leaders whenever they see it fit. Again, also it explains the differences, say, between the northern and southern shore of Mediterranean, because there were lots of natural harbors in the European part of Mediterranean. That's why more trade was conducted by sea. Okay, but in South Mediterranean, you will see that the number of natural harbors is less. Okay, that's why the majority of trade was conducted on land. Okay, and not on sea. Well, generally, this is the argument of John Gerring. I guess I've taken lots of time. Well, let me just add this last thing is that, as I said previously, the fundamental reason for the rise and development and the diffusion of parliamentarism, according to John Gerring and his co-authors, is the availability and proximity to natural harbors. But on the other hand, there is some other mechanism which is a little bit more intermediate mechanism, okay, and it ultimately depends on natural harbors itself, is the European diffusion. So what he means by that is that after Europeans had their parliamentarism because of natural harbors, when they migrated or when they colonized other parts of the world, in many cases they took the idea of parliamentarism with themselves to those places they migrated to or colonized, especially to those places where they constituted the majority. Whenever they were minority, they established authoritarian rules, like in South America. Whenever they were majority, like in North America or in Australia and New Zealand, they were safe. They were safe from the infringement of the minorities. Okay, so they thought that if we introduce democracy, those minorities, they will have a chance to vote, but they're minority at the end of the day. So Europeans, they felt secure from the threat coming from that minority. Okay, so minority was not able to affect the political outcome. That's why they introduced democracy. So this is the second mechanism, and this is a little bit more intermediate mechanism. That's why I do not spend lots of time explaining it. But again, statistically, he finds out that there is a connection between more of European diffusion and more democracy in 19th and 20th century. So this was in a nutshell the argument of John Gerring. I think it's enough, and that's it for this video.